Hi, this is David Rohal, and we are going to review our final lecture on collective behavior and social movements. Here we're going to focus on how people behave in large groups. This is very uniquely sociological in nature. Some psychologists do it, some political science do it, though they focus on social movements, the political aspects of that. We're going to touch on some of that, but we're more interested in why people get together in groups in the first place, and then ultimately how they use those groups to do different things, to try to do social change, but in some cases they are more or less successful, and the question is why. So we're going to break up the world into sort of rational explanations of behavior in crowds, especially in crowds that try to do social change, but it can apply to any crowds. And then what they call rational theories that explain why most collective action is rational in nature. It doesn't actually produce any violence like that we see on TV. We're going to look at actual behaviors in social movements and collective behavior, and we're going to finish up with small groups and ways to produce social change through the day-to-day interactions we have with people. So let's get started on this. All right, so collective behavior is action of people in groups or crowds. Usually it's a reaction to some event or some sort of emotion or sentiment that people have. So the image I'm trying to get across to you is, think of Washington, D.C., maybe New York or San Francisco, and something happens and large groups of people gather to express dissatisfaction or unhappiness with it. This is the most common example of what we mean by collective behavior. But it also can mean flash mobs or other situations where people get together. But the key is we have a lot of people together. They're acting in concert. They act together, but at the same time, they really don't know each other. And sort of it's a small, actually, it's a very difficult thing to fully understand because we don't know why people do it. We can theorize it about it, and that's what we're going to spend some time doing. But it's a very complicated thing when you think about it. So a lot of this really stems from a long time ago in the study of revolutions. I'm going to bring up the French Revolution as an example, but I just want to point out that we also confuse this with social movements. Now, some of these are like revolutions where there's a mix of people trying to change the world through things like called social movements, which are relatively rational, with the irrational behaviors we associate with revolutionary activities. And so both of these things kind of come together, and for some people they're synonymous, but technically they're not necessarily the same thing. You can act together as a group, collective action, but at the same time, that can be either physical or it can be through email or other things. So social movements can include collective behavior, but collective behavior does not necessarily lead to social movements. They might just be riots and things like that. So from a symbolic interaction perspective, I'm going to take you back to the French Revolution where it all started, at least the discussion of this, with a guy named Le Bon. Gustave Le Bon was not in the French Revolution, but he studied it, and he wanted to know what would take people who are relatively poor out of their houses to go out and massacre and kill thousands of people, people in some cases they interacted with on a regular basis. It's kind of a crazy thing. It still happens today. A very similar thing happened in Rwanda over a decade ago now, where people took their neighbors, people living next door, and killed them en masse. What would cause people to get up and do such a thing together? One day they're acting rational and normal. The next day they're out and killing people in large sums. So he kind of wanted to know a little bit about that. So he developed something called mass hysteria theory. And his argument is that when people are in crowds, they lose their ability to think rationally. And we're going to talk about different theories about why they do it, but he just simply argued that that's what he thought happened with the French Revolution. They get together, and not only are they emotional to begin with, but when they're around all these people, it heightens their emotion. We do know that people physiologically do become aroused simply being around people, whether it be one or two or thousands, but you can imagine being around larger groups of people would even be more exciting and so forth. He also argued that when people got into these crowds, they developed what he called contagious mental unity, a sense that they are bonding and connected as one. So there are three parts to how this happens with contagious mental unity leading to any kind of behavior, including executions or anything like that. First, as people come together in crowds, if you've ever been in a crowd with thousands of people around you, you'll know that in some places people are very close to each other, some places far apart, but everybody's kind of looking around to see what's going on and interacting with people, and develops this intensity of behavior as they interact with one another. But after a time, there's a mood that develops with the entire group, and they share similar actions and similar moods. We do know that people do act in very common ways, and we're going to talk about that later. But this mood thing is a very unique thing. He never studied it in a formal sense. He never interviewed people or anything. But from his reading of the French Revolution, it was very clear that when the group got together, they developed a similar sentiment or common sentiment that bonded them together. Now, the irrational behavior is a little more complicated. It's not as if this mood necessarily leads to irrational behavior. What typically happens is a leader or somebody in the group decides to act rationally. And then, like a contagion, that mood is transferred into the group, and more people get involved with that irrational behavior. Again, whether it's a leader telling the group to act in a certain way, or whether an individual just decides to do it, it leads to other people to do it with the same amount of fervor and emotion that the first person did. So together, Le Bon argued that these kind of things produce some of the most heinous behaviors in society. Theoretically, you could argue it could go the other direction. If led by the right person, it could go the other way. Martin Luther King was famous for his peaceful marches, and you could argue that the same sort of mood was developed there, but in his case directed it in a more positive direction than a negative one. Herbert Blumer, the famous symbolic interactionist who came up with the expression symbolic interaction, is part of this too. He also wanted to understand large group behavior, but he sort of differed from the other symbolic interactionists, Le Bon specifically, because he argued that these are rational people, and using the French Revolution is probably not a good example because that was a very unique time in history. But he said if you put a bunch of people together, you're going to have problems, but for somewhat different reasons. First of all, when people get together, he kind of likened them to a herd of cattle, and they just start milling together. But during this time, people are looking to each other for direction, and when they can't find it, they enter what he calls an interpretive phase. People have to decide, okay, this is what's going on, and this is what I'm supposed to do. But the key is they don't have complete communication. And again, if anybody's been to a large protest, you know that this is a very common thing. Nobody knows what to do, and it's very hard to get information across to a lot of people at the same time. But as a result, this lack of communication can cause stress and anxiety as people try to figure out what to do. And if the communication process is interrupted, it could lead to what he calls circular reaction, something that ultimately produces stress from this lack of communication. And hence, they become very suggestible to almost any direction, leading to some of the same things that Le Bon argued in his theory. We're going to take a break for a second and just talk briefly about a term that I think is important just to consider in this idea of collective identity. This is very much like group identity. So whether it be a small group or a large group, the same logic applies. Like our own personal identity, groups have an identity, a sense of who they are, and that only becomes important because we construct a sense of who we are from a group, but the group itself has a certain identity as well. And so groups will often have mission statements on their websites and things like that, and that's supposed to reflect the type of group that they are. This is only important for our discussion here because so far we've talked about collective behavior as sort of this large-scale movement of people doing similar behaviors at the same time. In this case, it's a large-scale collective thought or feeling about a group that is conjured at the same time and place. Anytime you hear somebody say something like, that's just the way we are, or something like that, they're just saying that's the identity of the group. But the point is that quite often people develop this sense of identity without having a website with specific goals and so forth. And so groups have had identities long before there were websites. And how do people get a sense of what groups are like? Well, they just spend time with those people and ultimately get a sense of what the whole group is like. and develop those same sentiments at the same time individually, even without direction. So we're going to switch gears. The last couple of theories focused on irrational behaviors, or largely irrational behaviors in groups through symbolic interaction. We're going to look at some rational behavior as well through theories like emergent norm theory, Smelser's value-added theory, perception control, and so forth. There's a lot of them, and the big thing you want to get across, I want to get across, is that you get a sense of what they are in general. There's a lot of details, whole books written on each of these, so we can't possibly cover them all. The big thing I want to point out, though, is that we use Rwanda and we use the French Revolution as examples of large-scale aggressive events, but most events are not very bad at all. In fact, later on, I'm going to talk about the fact that most protest movements are very small. They just don't get any press coverage. So even no matter what the group is, the vast majority of them are not violent in nature in any way. They're very rational. Emergent norm theory is one of the first ones that people talk about when they try to explain behavior in groups, and why most of them are rational, and in some cases they're not rational, but that's the exception. One thing that makes this theory unique is that it focuses on the idea that each person going into a group has different perspectives and attitudes. They're individuals. They're not just simply zombies walking off the street doing whatever the group tells them to do. In that sense, then, these people with unique attitudes are called differential expression. They come with different perspectives on the movement and their role in it. The four different types of people that come to movements, these are just four, but there could be more. But the four common examples include ego-involved, concerned, insecure, and curiosity. And again, if you've been to a protest, if you haven't, if you ever have a chance to do it, look around and you're going to see this is a very common thing for any of these kind of groups. The ego-involved participant is someone who's very motivated by the social movement. They really want to cause the change, and quite often they're either a senior volunteer or a paid staff member of the group. And so they go out and they try to get people involved, whether it be a protest or any other way. It might be signing a petition or whatever. These are the people that get it done. They get it done because they care the most. They care so much that they're in some cases they go and get a job for the organization. In other cases, they're willing to volunteer their time because it's so important to them. But for every one of them, there's three other types, probably most common for us. The concerned participant is simply someone who is concerned. They are interested in the movement. They do want to participate, but they're not willing to work for the movement, and they're certainly not willing to volunteer too much. It's not that they're not willing to volunteer, but they're not going to give up too much of their time. So again, they're going to work and they're going to try to help the movement, but there's limits to their time and involvement in it. Then you have the insecure and the curiosity seekers. The insecure participant is simply someone, they might have some interest in the movement and so forth and want to participate, but to be quite frank, it's really not that important to them. So they could take it or leave it. And if a riot were to begin, they certainly wouldn't jump right in and participate like the ego involved, or maybe the concerned participant. They're going to leave right away because they don't care that much about it. And finally, the curiosity seeker. This is very common. I've been a curiosity seeker on I don't know how many protest movements back on the East Coast. Just showing up, sort of see what's going on. You may have some concern over the issues being addressed there, but you're just there to see what's going on, and that's it. And there's a lot of these people at a lot of the different big events that occur. It might even be someone who happened to be there when the protest started, and so they're just sort of hanging out and sort of observing what's going on. The reason that these four things are important, by the way, is that it determines your action in it. So again, the people that are most concerned about the movements are more likely to engage in any sort of behavior. The people, the curiosity seekers, are the least likely to engage in any behavior, good or bad. The next theory that's considered a rational theory of collective behavior is called value-added theory. The idea of value-added is that the more we know about a particular event or movement, the more we can explain the behaviors of the people in those groups. In this particular theory, there's a lot to it. I just want to focus on what I think it brings to the study of collective behavior that makes it unique. And that is, just like we have unique types of people that go to these events, we also have unique movements. Not everything is a protest in Washington, D.C. We have other things that go on and they dictate how people are going to behave. And they include things like panics, crazes, hostile outbursts, and social movements. I'm just going to briefly cover these. I think you'll understand them completely when you hear what I have to say about them. But I want to conjure in you the image that you have of each one of these to understand why the behaviors in them are going to be radically different. A panic might be something like somebody yelling fire at a theater, and people are obviously in a panic. And guess how people act when they're in panic? Well, they act very irrationally. In some cases, they might hurt each other in order to save themselves. Panics could include other things like when the stock market fell in the 1930s and we went into a Great Depression. But people panicked. In this case, though, instead of hurting each other, they went out and took money out of banks, which totally destroyed the banks. And as a result, all the problems, financial problems, showed up. But it's a way that panics can show up differently. But the key of the panics is they're irrational. Crazes are also irrational, but this is more about, for instance, popular things. So the classic example of the hula hoop was a craze, I believe, in the 1960s, and which people went out and spent money on this item. And even though it was totally irrational at the time, but people felt like they had to do it. Very emotional, but it doesn't lead to violence as a whole. There are stories of products that do lead to violence, that people show up and they fight over getting some sort of product that they want to get for Christmas, and they fight to get those things. So it can lead to violence, but generally we associate them with just emotional behavior, but not necessarily violent. Hostile outbursts are probably more closely associated with riots, or people hearing a court decision going out and causing riots, but other kind of angry outbursts and so forth. So once again, very emotional, but in this case, the emotion quite often does lead to violence and vandalism. Social movements are of two different types, and the only reason to bring that out is social movements can be more or less emotional, and they can focus on different things. Norm-oriented social movements are typically associated with changing a particular law in society, and a value-oriented social movement is designed to focus on changing our general focus as a whole group. So a norm might be as simple as changing, the speed limit, or it might even be legalizing marijuana or something like this. But value-oriented is trying to change society in a bigger sense, such as focusing less on the market, focusing less on consumption and consumerism. These are trying to change the way we live our entire lives. And most of these social movements, both norm and value-oriented social movements, are not violent in nature, and sometimes they don't even involve protests. In other cases, they do, such as the pro-life march that occurs in Washington, D.C. every year. Those do involve protests. Other times it's signing a petition or being associated with a blog site or something like that. So let's talk about determinants of collective behavior according to value added. I'm not going to go over all these in detail. You can read this in your text, but it's important to point out that we don't know what a collective action will lead to without knowing some background information. So I'm going to briefly just sort of talk about a few of these things so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. One thing that has to occur for a social movement to be successful is that the society they're trying to make a change to has to be able to handle that change. So during the early years of the Russian Revolution, before the Russian Revolution, they tried to change the society radically to be more like Western Europe. But to be quite frank, they didn't have the money and they didn't have the infrastructure to make some of those changes. So while the West was doing industrial revolution, the Russians weren't able to produce the type of industrial revolution found in the West. They just couldn't do it. So the society has to be set up in a way that allows for social change to happen in the first place. So the question is the structure conducive to change? Will it be able to handle that change without totally falling apart? Many communist revolutions occurred in South America in the last 50 years. A lot of them failed miserably simply because their systems, their social, political, and economic systems could not handle the kind of changes that the political leaders tried to induce. Generalized belief, I'll just mention briefly, is this idea that people also have to be ready for it. Their thinking processes have to be able to accept that. You could debate this about the Russian Revolution and communism there, but it could be argued that one reason it didn't stay, that is, it changed in the 2000s, is that the Russians were not able to accept such a radically different way of life. Perception control theory is also sort of a rational perspective on what happens in collective action and social movements. It's based on this idea that people need to communicate during social movements and social collective action, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. There's at least 3 different ways that leaders of these movements try to maintain communication: independent, interdependent, and organizational instructions. But the point is that if any of those get interrupted, it could lead to chaos as people try to figure out what they're supposed to do. I'm trying to create, again, an image of thousands of people getting together, and how do you control those people. But it also could be through social movements, that is, through over email and the internet, trying to communicate, whether you're on the ground at a protest or trying to create a larger social movement in the country. So we're kind of moving here a little bit to talk about what people actually do during collective events. We go back and forth between social movements, like on the internet and things like that, with protests on the ground. But a lot of research has gone into this since the 1960s, looking at what people do actually on the ground. And some of these things are relevant in almost any situation, but others are more focused on the classic examples that we get from Washington, D.C. and all those kind of movements. So let's bring up a couple of things here before we get into that. One is research mobilization theory. And research mobilization theory takes a lot of what we've talked about up to this point to talk about what people are able to put together in order to make social change in the first place, the resources they bring to bear. And so there's a lot of people that want social change in the world, but if they don't have the resources to be able to make that change, then it won't lead to anything at all. Today we have what's called social movement organizations. These are groups that try to mobilize the resources they need to make social change. Often that means they come to people like you and me and ask for some money in order to create websites and other types of advertising to bring people together en masse to do protests and so forth. There are whole jobs in this, by the way, and a lot of them obviously are based in the D.C. area, but they're in most big cities. You're going to find them. Political process theory takes this idea and looks at all of the different groups that are competing for social change. So you really want to change something in society. You want to legalize marijuana or some other thing that's really important to you. Well, you're one group, but there might be groups that actually have the opposite goal. So whether it be a norm or a value-oriented social movement, you start a political change organization of some kind, a social movement organization, you've got to keep in mind that there are other people that are competing and actually might be developing a group that's going against the movement that you have. And so understanding why some social movements are more successful than others is not enough to look just about resources and so forth. We also have to look at the politics of it as well. And I'm not talking about politics as in Washington, D.C. politics. I'm talking about the politics of the different groups that are vying for different perspectives. So this is where we want to get into what people do when they're actually in groups. There are 3 phases. Now here we're talking about, again, mostly protests, whether we're talking about Ferguson protest or DC protest or anything else. Assembling, gathering, and dispersal phases. In the assembling phase, this is what brings people together in the first place. Research generally shows that people learn about these kind of protests through friends and family and so forth. But the biggest thing, the biggest predictor of whether you're going to go to one of these events is being asked. The other thing that's important to know is that it's typically people with no other obligations. They tend to be students. or they tend to, or scheduling, I mean, they tend to be students, and they tend to be older people. In the 60s, it would be people that were staying home with the kids because, again, they had the flexible schedule to be able to show up and do these things. During the gathering phase, this is what people do when they're actually there. And it's really not going to be a big surprise to know that people don't just stand there in a group of 10,000 people. They typically cluster into smaller groups of friends and family. There's lines that form up to get services and so forth. And if you don't know it, by the way, you have to register if you're going to do most of these protests. Now, some of them are just people that show up without much thought. But if you're planning to do a social movement and a protest as part of it, you have to get a permit. Now, that's only important to know because that's where you get all the services. When you have 10,000 people, they need a place to go to the bathroom, and they need a place to buy food and so forth. So by registering your event, you get those kind of services to show up, and as a result, in at least American culture, we tend to form lines to get those services. As individuals, when they're in groups, they tend to form arcs and rings around performers or speakers and things like that. And of course, use different noises and gestures to make their thoughts and feelings known. And symbols are very important. Signs are very prevalent, and what people wear and so forth, so as to gain attention, to show people how people feel about the particular issue that they're addressing. The dispersal phase is probably one of the most challenging. When I went to a protest in Washington, D.C., at the end of it, they opened up all of the metro for free and just kept shuttling people out. Now, they weren't trying to be generous, and they weren't supporting the movement. What they wanted to do is to get tens of thousands of people out of the Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, with the least amount of hassle. Because they know if the dispersal is not done well and people get frustrated, it's going to lead people to violence. And it's not because they don't like each other. It's because people are in a hurry to get somewhere, and other people are blocking them, and they take the frustration out on other people. The vast majority of dispersals are routine in nature. People know what to do. They know they have to wait, and they typically wait their turn. They get out of town, and everything's fine. There are at least two other types of dispersals, though, that often lead to violence in one way or another. Coerced dispersals, where police decide that they don't like the behavior of the people in the protest, and so they try to get them out, and that obviously leads to violence in many different ways. And finally, emergency dispersals. Something bad happens, a fire or something like that, people need to get out, and that leads to violence as people compete to get out of the place, and other things as well. So, what has it been like over the last 30 years looking at protest movements and so forth? Well, we kind of reviewed all that with this different things. I just want to point out that they usually don't involve civil disobedience. They're almost, the majority of them are very small in nature. In some cases, as little as 3 or 4 or a dozen people. But I want to point out that the reason we don't hear about those is they don't make the news. The only thing that makes the news are when we see lots of people competing to get attention in the media. One of the last things I want to point out is this concept of collective memory. Collective memory is the idea that every society develops a shared belief about a person, an event, or interaction or object. Think about different people from American history. I mentioned earlier Martin Luther King, but there's also George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Booker T. Washington. We could also talk about different events, the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, and I could keep going on and on. The point is, what do you conjure? What thoughts and feelings do you conjure when you hear those things? For many of us, we have some of the same beliefs. We have the same value system. If you thought positive feelings and thoughts about, for instance, the Civil Rights Movement, that's probably very common. That's a very common understanding and memory of that event. Not everybody has that feeling, but it's still something that is very common. On the other hand, it can be a little more controversial. You have people like Christopher Columbus. For some people, it initiates anger. For other people, again, a hero. But the fact is that we carry a lot of things in common. We share a lot of those things. And so just like we act with homogeneity with regard to how we behave in groups like protests and so forth, we can act in homogeneity in our thoughts and feelings toward people and events and so forth. So this is just an extension of collective behavior. All right, now we're going to finish up with a discussion of group processes and collective behavior. This is kind of like a mini version of the political process theory, how different groups compete to get their social change agenda going. So the first thing I want to talk about is this concept of coalition or alliance that forms between people. Now this happens on a small scale. There are whole journals dedicated to group behavior, and one of the most common behaviors they focus on is coalition. Whether it be at work and you develop a coalition of people to get certain things done at work, you believe that the organization go a certain direction and so forth. But the idea of coalition also applies to whole societies as different people work together to try to get their goals achieved, and other groups try to get their goals achieved, very much like political process theory. So what can you do with that information? Well, one is that's how political process theory works with social change organizations. If you're a member of one, if you're an ego-involved participant or concerned, then you probably want to develop a coalition to achieve your goals, because no one of us has enough money to make a change. There are a few people out there, George Soros and other people, that are very rich, and that what they say does impact society, but the rest of us have to work in groups to do it. The problem when we work in groups is this thing called the free rider problem. When actors reap the benefits of the group without incurring the cost. This is very common in work groups for school, but also work groups in real life. You've got 4 or 5 people who have a mission. They've got to get something done, a project for school, like I said, or a project for work. But 1 or 2 people don't do the work, but the rest of you have to do it. And of course, none of us likes that. Why is that important to the coalitions and social change? Because it's the same thing. Why do some groups succeed more than others? And the problem with a lot of groups is they try to make some change. They develop a coalition, but their fear of the free rider problem makes it very difficult for them to keep that coalition alive, and hence it ends. So there develops a social dilemma in which the person has to act in their own interest versus the group. So if you're a rich person and you want to make social change, the only person you're accountable to is yourself. But if you're like the rest of us who have to rely on coalitions, we have the free rider problem, and then we have to make this dilemma. Do I stay in the group and do all the work and reap the benefits, even though I won't get all the credit, just so that I can have a coalition, or do I act in my own interest and leave? And of course, that is a very common outcome of group dynamics. So let's bring it all together. Here we talked a lot about different things. Here we talked about both interactionist perspective that focuses on how groups have a power over individuals, and that power can be used for social change or not. And it focuses on theories like mass hysteria and circular reaction, but also emergent norm. We also have theories that are more rational in nature, and some of them are social structure and some of them are symbolic interaction. And that includes, again, emergent norm, value-added theory, and perception control theory, resource mobilization theory, and political process theories. We also looked at what people do when they're actually in groups, the assembling, gathering, and dispersal phases, as well as the concept of collective memory. Finally, we looked at the concept of coalition in groups and why collective behavior and action are not always successful, and it might have something to do with basic group dynamics. So I hope that you've seen that it's a pretty powerful thing to look at the impact of large groups, and we can't look at the impacts of society on the individual without understanding how people are impacted by group and group dynamics, especially on the large scale, but how small scale a group dynamic can be applied to large scale interactions in groups as well. So I hope you can take this in and help understand that you have a bridge or a connection to larger society through these groups, and you can be a part of both social change not only in your personal life but also in society as well.